Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Great to have your company. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. Under pressure, Foreign Minister Penny Wong says she doesn't accept the premise of South Africa's genocide case against Israel, while at the same time handing out Australian aid money to an organisation that's been accused of indirectly funding Hamas terrorism. More Islamic hate in Sydney, with one Muslim cleric praying to Allah for the Jews to be killed one by one. So you got to ask, don't you, where are the authorities enforcing our laws to prevent this? Plus, crime continues to be front of mind for fearful residents in both Victoria and Queensland, as their state governments seem inept at cracking down on the most violent of offences. Horrific footage of more home invasions, this time with knives in Melbourne. I'll get into those details a little later. And revelations today that the Prime Minister rejected a review into supermarket prices a year ago, only to capitulate and announce one last week. Is it any wonder a poll this week says that 80% of Australians believe he will do nothing to address their rising cost of living?
Our priority is making sure that shoppers can get goods at the checkout at the cheapest possible price.
But first, I'm sure you've noticed how careful our Foreign Minister is not to be clearly on Israel's side in its war against Hamas terrorists. Now, sure, overnight in Jerusalem, Penny Wong met with some of the families of the 240 innocent Israelis taken hostage by Hamas, and she rightly called for their immediate, unconditional release. But she also insisted on what she called, quote, a sustained ceasefire, which would inevitably mean leaving Hamas wounded but not beaten in charge of Gaza to regroup once more and wreak havoc on the Middle East's only democracy. Now, we weren't half-hearted when we took on Islamic State a few years back, but somehow Israel is being told by Wong to be half-hearted in going after the Hamas terror state that wants them wiped off the map. Now, just as bad is Senator Wong's continued cop-out when it comes to Australia's position on South Africa's bid to have Israel found guilty of genocide by the International Court of Justice. Even though it's almost obscene to have Jews, the victims, let's never forget, of history's worst genocide, smeared in this way. Wong is weak not to take a clear position here, opposing South Africa's move. But weaker still is the Prime Minister, who barely seems across the issue at all.
We're not participants in this. This is the actions of South Africa taking action at the ICJ. The Foreign Minister made clear Australia's position. That doesn't mean that we agree with some of the assumptions that are there in the South African case at all.
Now, since when did Australia sit on the fence like this? And since when do we outsource our foreign policy to the zealots on Labor's left, with a Prime Minister who's just not across the big issues as he should be? Now, I might add, the very notion that Israel's somehow deliberately exterminating the Arabs, because that's what genocide means in an international court of law, well, that's not just absurd, but clearly it's factually wrong. Arabs who live in Israel have all the same rights as Jewish Israelis. Indeed, 9 of them at last count even sit in the Israeli parliament. Now, if there's anyone pursuing genocide, it's Hamas, who are formally and officially pledged to the complete extermination of the Jewish homeland. Just as weak from the Prime Minister was his refusal to commit to listing Yemen's Houthis, the group that's been rocketing merchant ships in the Red Sea, on Australia's official list of terror organisations. I mean, seriously, he should have done this already, yet here he is again, Albanese, sitting on the fence. Even though a couple of days back, he insisted that we were, and I quote, involved and participated in Anglo-American airstrikes against these Houthis, despite the truth revealed yesterday of a very small number of extra personnel not even yet in the Middle East.
We're making an appropriate contribution, as Australia always does, we always play our role. We do have people there, and the release from the United States made that very clear. The joint release that we were involved and participated.
The Americans are starting to impose costs on Tehran, but if we don't realise this is the bigger picture, then visits like the foreign ministers just look like irrelevant hand-waving.
More and more, this government looks incapable of decisive action, constantly responding to events rather than trying to shape them. But it's not just that it looks increasingly spineless and impotent. Worse, it seems to have no moral compass. How can anyone be morally even-handed between the Liberal Democratic government of Israel and a terrorist group that revels in the slaughter of women, children and even babies? Yet the Green Left has so colonised the Labor Party that people like Senator Wong see this conflict through a cultural Marxist prism of oppressed Palestinians and the oppressor being Israelis, where the former are always at least half justified. Now, it's no wonder their headline announcement for her trip has been not further deployment of Australian military to the Middle East, but more aid for Palestine, including $6 million for a UN agency that the federal opposition says has indirectly funded Hamas in the past and run schools that preached anti-Semitism.
We'll contributed an additional $21.5 million in humanitarian assistance to the Middle East, including in response to the crisis, humanitarian needs resulting from the Hamas-Israel conflict. And will involve $4 million to the Red Cross and Red Crescent, $6 million to UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency.
In fairness, though, it has to be said that it's not just the Albanese government that's got trouble working out whose side it's really on. The British Conservative Party is deeply split between those who think the UK government has a duty to take stronger action against illegal arrivals by boat and the bleeding hearts in the party who think that people from third world countries have the right to game the system. It really blew up last night. I'll get to that a little bit later in the show. Then, of course, there's our own politically correct human rights establishment that's only too quick to condemn cartoonists commenting on Indigenous dysfunction like Bill Leak, but is completely missing in action on Islamist hate preachers. The latest example of an Islamic preacher inciting violence against Jews, reported today in The Australian, is Sheikh Kamal Abu Mariam, leader of Sydney's Roselands Mosque, attacking the, and I quote, Zionist Nazi regime and calling on God, he says, to kill them one by one. Now, the only reason this is tolerated for a second is because the Green Left views Muslim Palestinians as victims who can hardly do any wrong. Plus, a whole lot of Muslim migrants live in Labor seats in Western Sydney, and that vote pulls the strings of Albanese frontbenchers like Tony Burke and Chris Bowen. And what about these so-called music festivals? I mean, really, they're illegal drug festivals. I discussed that last night. An official establishment that's zealous on cracking down on smoking and vaping reacts to death and injury from illegal drugs, not by reminding young people that doing drugs is deadly, but by urging pill testing so that the users and the bikies that sell them can be protected from their own stupidity. These are strange times where the moral distinctions and the values that our parents took for granted have been badly blurred or even completely ignored. Now, rest assured, though, here on Credlin, all this will be consistently called out because that's what you want. You want these errors to be exposed and corrected, not simply ignored. All right, we'll get the headlines now. We'll go to Canberra with Sky News political reporter Joel Philp.
Good evening. China's ambassador to Australia has given a rare press conference answering questions from journalists at the Chinese embassy. Ambassador Chao Zhen revealed that the Chinese government had told Foreign Minister Penny Wong that it strongly opposed her voicing her opinion after the recent Taiwanese election, and that his country will not budge on its stance that Taiwan is a part of China.
We're ready to compromise. We're ready to show flexibility on many issues, for example, in trade issues. But on the question of Taiwan, there's no room at all for us to show flexibility or to make compromise because it involves China's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
He also revealed the perspective of China's defence leaders on Australia's allegations a Chinese warship injured Australian divers with a sonar pulse.
They didn't initiate the so-called sonar against the divers from the Australian side. What they said is, should they have initiated the sonar from the Chinese ship against the divers, it would cause immediate fatality.
He then said that third country was Japan. The ambassador said he expected remaining trade restrictions on Australian produce to be resolved in the coming months, and that in exchange, China also expected Chinese wind towers to be allowed into Australia. He said he believed it was unlikely detained Australian academic Young Hen Jun would be allowed out of jail in the same way Australian journalist Cheng Lei had recently been.
The case of Young Hen Jun is very much a case different in nature from the case of Cheng Lei. So to be honest, I cannot expect that the case would come to such a conclusion. Likewise,
Foreign Minister Penny Wong has pledged to almost double humanitarian aid funding for Gaza, saying she's gravely concerned by worsening conditions for civilians caught up in the Israel-Hamas war. On her diplomatic tour of the Middle East, she's met Israeli leaders and the families of Israelis being held hostage by Hamas. Back home, she's facing criticism for not visiting the Israeli towns attacked on October 7.
I think it's unforgivable that Penny Wong has not visited the massacre sites. I hope she changes her mind on that. She should see the areas that on October the 7th changed this landscape forever.
Well, that trip was controversial before she landed in the Middle East, and it's certainly controversial now that she's there. Let's get my next guest's take on that and all the headlines across the board. Bringing in now Sky News journalist Caroline Marcus and Senior Fellow at the Menzies Research Centre, Nick Cater. Welcome to you both. Caroline, I'll start with you if I can. It's taken her well over 100 days for anyone, not just Penny Wong, but anyone senior from the Australian government to get to Israel. As I said, controversial before she even landed. This position today on the court case being brought by South Africa, who of course are proxies for others against Israel for genocide, and this on-the-fence position from our government. What's been the reaction from Jewish leaders here in Australia?
Well, it hasn't been positive, that's for sure. The Jewish leaders who've spoken out about this have basically said that the position from Australia should have been much stronger on that case that South Africa brought in the International Court of Justice, just like the other Western allies to Israel have been. For example, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, called the case meritless and galling. British leader Rishi Sunak said it was completely unjustified and wrong, and Germany attacked the political instrumentalization of the case and vowed to intervene on Israel's behalf. But we've instead seen our Foreign Minister Penny Wong make what has been Australia's strongest point about this yet, which is a very low bar to begin with, in when she said that she didn't accept the premise of South Africa's case against Israel. She also said that Australia respected the independence of the court and its role in upholding international law. But let's face it, Peter, she doesn't come out and say that they reject the claim of genocide against Israel that South Africa is making. Her statement was not clear and unequivocal in that sense. So just on top, when you take it in the context that it's taken 100 days for anyone from Australia, and the Prime Minister himself hasn't visited Israel, when you take into account the fact that Penny Wong is not visiting the sites of those atrocities committed on October 7, and her statement that she put out immediately following the October 7 attacks before Israel had even responded, urging restraint from Israel, I think that the response from Jewish leaders and from the Israelis themselves will be that they feel very disheartened.
And look, in politics, in media, in diplomacy, there's a code that's written, as you've just stepped your way through it there, Caroline, for people to read. So Wong is sending a clear message to left-wing supporters inside Labor, Green types. Yes, I'm there, but I'm there kicking and screaming. I waited 100 days. I'm not saying what others are saying in relation to the ICJ. I'm not going down to the side of the atrocities. And of course, today, this announcement of aid for the Palestinians, $21 million. That brings to Australia's total $46 million. And Nick Cater, there are justifiable concerns from the opposition that, as in the past, this sort of funding could end up in the hands of groups linked to terrorism.
Well, I think it's almost certain that they will fall into the wrong hands unless Penny Wong has cast iron guarantees, unless you can show the channels through which this money will be spent and can show and can guarantee that this money will go to relieve the hardships of ordinary Palestinians. I personally have no confidence in that whatsoever. I mean, as you know, the Palestinian people collectively receive the most aid per head of population of any group in the world, and we know that most of that, if not...
Oh, we've lost Nick there. I think... Caroline, we'll go to you. I want to pick up the story today about a Sydney City Council. It has a sister city arrangement with a known Hezbollah terrorist stronghold in South Lebanon. It's a town, Jebel, where 2 Australian Lebanese brothers were killed in an airstrike last month. We've got all these local councils, 81 at last count, who seem to hate Australia Day. But we've got one in Sydney. It's a real worry here, linked to a Hezbollah, which is the north, a Hezbollah organisation in Lebanon.
It's become a real cliche, but councils do need to stick to roads, rates and rubbish, don't they? I mean, just take this sister city arrangement. You mentioned 2 Australian brothers there. We should remind our viewers that one of those brothers who was killed was a fighter that Hezbollah, a prescribed terror organisation, claimed as one of its own. He and his brother and his brother's fiancée, all their coffins were draped in Hezbollah flags and given military-style funerals after they had died. So, look, this area is a known stronghold. What is a local Sydney Council doing, having any kind of friendly arrangement with a place where rockets are being fired at innocent Israeli civilians? That should not be happening. The federal government does need to intervene, and indeed they can. They have the power to do that with these kinds of arrangements, and it should be done.
And yet another day, Caroline, and another story in The Australian this time, exposing yet another Islamic hate preacher in Sydney. I went through the details there. This is a preacher in Sydney's Roselands Mosque. Kill the Jews, he says, he's praying to Allah that they are killed one by one. Now, I mentioned Bill Leak. I mean, Bill Leak faced human rights attacks over a cartoon about a deadbeat Aboriginal dad. And these preachers could call for the murder of Jews week in, week out, and it appears there's no consequences.
You know, Peter, over summer when you were on holiday and I was filling in for you, I spoke about this issue night after night. There was one preacher after the next who we exposed as saying the most inciting, hateful words about Jewish people and basically inciting their followers to, if not kill them, then support the murder of Jews. It is atrocious that this is allowed to continue in our country without any consequences for these people. And indeed, Jewish leaders have made the point that if the federal government is not going to act on the laws that we have to protect citizens from this type of vilification and incitement to violence, then they are going to have to take their own legal action through the court system to ensure that the community is protected. It's sad, it's unfortunate that leaders feel that they have to take it upon, the community leaders feel they have to take it upon themselves to do that. But if our federal government fails to protect us, then what other choice do they have?
Well, let's go to economic issues because we have this industrial action plaguing our ports. It's huge. It'll hit consumers on the cost of goods they get when they eventually are moved by the stevedores into our shops and off the boats. The PM's refusing to step in and help sort out the issues. He's indeed even taken a swipe at the port operators, DP World. He said it's a Dubai-based company that's, quote, made considerable profits. But I might remind viewers, Nick Cater, these are workers who earn, on average, $130,000 a year. Now, I don't begrudge them being paid good money, but their union is demanding a further 16% wage hike. Again, which means all those costs get passed on to us. You can see why the company says we want to talk about it.
Well, exactly. There have to be signs of genuine increases in productivity to justify any pay rise. And as you say, they are very well paid, very well remunerated, and very good conditions under which they work. This idea that DP World somehow makes too much profit, I mean, and it just goes to show the Prime Minister is just has no idea about business and investment. If they weren't making a profit, they would not invest in this country and they wouldn't bring their expertise and their port handling skills and machinery to this country, which in the end help make imports and exports cheaper. And that's vital for a country like ours, that we have free-flowing ports, that the stories we hear now of containers piled up on the docks waiting to be moved, that is really bad for the economy and it's bad for inflation. And the Prime Minister just seems to be out of touch with what business needs to keep those ports running.
And I also might add, it's our exports going out as much as it is the imports coming in. I'll talk to the Farmers Federation about that point tomorrow. A lot of stuff spoiling on docks because it can't exit the ports. Hey, Caroline, what's this story in New South Wales? Some talk that jury deliberations are going to be time limited. I read this morning, and as a lawyer, that's a huge red flag to me. What's it about?
Well, as it turns out, here in New South Wales, juries have a minimum amount of time in which they have to reach a verdict without where it can be like a majority verdict. So in other words, it's a bit complicated, but in other words, in New South Wales currently, jury must deliberate for a minimum of 8 hours, and if they can't reach a unanimous verdict, then an 11-1 verdict would be accepted. Now there are calls to change the law so that this minimum period is reduced in half to 4 hours. In other words, they'd only have to deliberate for 4 hours, and if they can't unanimously agree, a court would accept that majority verdict in that case. Now, there are lawyers who are saying that this would not be fair in the process, that it would lead to pressure on jurors to make decisions. It would be disastrous for the legal system. But it is also worth pointing out that in other states across the country, these minimum periods are actually much lower. And that's not to say that that should be the case, but New South Wales is already one of the strictest. For example, in Victoria, they don't even have a minimum period. They just have to deliberate for a reasonable amount of time, which is obviously incredibly subjective. And in other states, it's as little as 2 or 4 hours that they have to deliberate. So there's a really inconsistent period across the board when it comes to jury deliberations.
Yeah, as I said, it's a real worry to me. Nick Cater, Caroline Marcus, thank you both for your time. Let's go down to the state of Victoria. It's experiencing a crime wave. Robberies are up almost 40% and break-and-enters in particular are up 23%. Crimes committed by minors have also reached a 9-year high, and 82 youth offenders have been arrested more than 10 times over the past year. We've seen arson attacks on businesses and cost of living pressures, we're told, are causing a rise in shoplifting. So what can be done? Victorian MP, former party leader Michael O'Brien, well, he said, let's start by opening the local police station in his suburb 24 hours a day. It was, in recent days, the suburb that saw some horrific home invasions. It is the suburb of Malvern. Michael O'Brien joins me now. Thank you for your time. I guess it's the practical stuff that make a real difference. A police station open 24 hours, I would have thought that was normal, but you've got one that only operates business hours.
Good evening, Peter. Yeah, look, you're right. My police station of Malvern Services, my electorate, my community was open 24 hours a day until about 4 months ago. And then the state government, through the Victoria Police, decided to shut it down between every hour except between 10 a.m. and 7 p.m. So if you want to commit a crime in Malvern, wait till they clock off at 7:01. And obviously your chances are increased. Now, the government will say, and the police will say, look, just because the building's closed to the public doesn't mean the police aren't there. But the fact is we've seen a 42.6% increase in burglaries in my community in the last year alone. We saw a horrific spate of 6 aggravated burglaries in one night this week. And the fact that our police station is closed at night means that my community is frightened. And frankly, for a government that wastes money on everything that doesn't matter, it should be investing money in community safety, which is the primary responsibility of any government.
My team in Sydney, Michael, are just pulling up that footage of the home invasions in your area. I mean, they were horrific. People accosted in their own homes, cars were stolen, knives were used. We can see some of that footage there. This is on home CCTV. These offenders fled and they've just literally moved from street to street to street. I think you're right in saying there was 6 homes broken into. You can see most of them there have decent home security. They've got significant fences, but they're still under attack. And we've seen there's been cuts to 43 police stations across the state. We know that there's now 300 fewer officers in the Victorian Police than there were a year ago. It doesn't seem like crime is much of a priority for the Allen government.
Look, you're right, and to my mind, that is an absolute dereliction of duty. The first responsibility of any government is to try and protect the citizens, and the government has failed on that. So say this is a government that thinks nothing of wasting money on all sorts of major project blowouts and sweetheart union deals, but when it comes to recruiting Victoria police officers, when it comes to even striking a fair pay deal with the Police Association, it seems to be something that this Allen Labor government is completely incapable of doing. And what worries me as a local member and a shadow Attorney General is that we are fast becoming a state where people aren't safe in their own homes, don't feel safe in their own homes, and this government doesn't have a plan to deal with it.
What about recidivism or repeat offending? I went through that stat there. You've got about 82, I think it was, young people arrested over 10 times. We know the former Premier wanted to increased, I think, about 14, the age of criminal responsibility. But also, someone told me that Labor had passed a law last year that makes it even easier on bail to do the wrong thing.
Look, Peter, we've got a revolving door when it comes to bail in Victoria, and that's about to get turbocharged. Labor has passed a law, it hasn't come into effect yet, but what they did is they abolished an offence which the former coalition government, of which I was a minister, created, which said if you're on bail and you commit another serious offence, you face a much higher test if you want to try and get bail again. Now, Labor's gone and abolished that offence. It hasn't taken effect yet. But once it does, what it means is that you can commit an aggravated burglary one day, the police can arrest you, you can go and seek bail again, and you'll potentially face the lowest test for bail yet again. There's no uplift in the test for bail because of what Labor has done. And to my mind, this is just madness. It's going to mean that the revolving door of criminals getting arrested, getting bail and being back on the streets is just going to be supercharged. And frankly, it means that Victorians have got even less reason to feel safe than they do today.
You were the former Treasurer in Victoria at one time. The state's debt's about to hit $240 billion. If you listen to the Labor government, they say it's all about COVID, but they only spent about $30 billion on COVID. We had a whole lot of taxes that came in from 1 January in Victoria. Victorians are already the most heavily taxed people of any state. But a new report out today says that parents in Victoria in public education pay more than anywhere else, or pay more than $100,000 to put their child through school, primary and secondary, over the course of the 12 years. Now, none of this stacks up. None of this, Michael, none of it stacks up.
I'm actually the last Liberal Treasurer of Victoria, Peter. When I think about the set of books that I handed over when we lost the election in 2014 and where we are today, it makes you cry. We had a AAA credit rating, we had a budget in surplus, we had tax cuts, we had infrastructure spends. This government has taken our state debt from under $22 billion. It'll be $178 billion at the end of this budget cycle. It's just criminal. And as the Auditor General found last year, the government has no plan to pay it back. They don't even have a plan to reduce the debt at any stage in the future. All we're seeing from Labor is more taxes, more waste. And it's hitting the people who can least afford it. It used to be that state education in Victoria was supposed to be compulsory, secular and free. Well, it's arguably compulsory, although truancy rates are up. It's arguably secular. In fact, this government does everything to chase any form of religion out of anything, but it's certainly not free. It is the most expensive state in which to send your child to a state school in the country. And this is a government that doesn't get the basics right. They can't run a hospital system, they can't run the education system, and they can't keep people safe. So why are we the highest tax people in the country? Because we've got a government that doesn't have the right priorities for Victorians.
Michael O'Brien, thank you. Right after the break, we'll go to Queensland where the new Premier up there, Stephen Miles, is looking just as inept as his predecessor when it comes to cost blowouts and crime. Plus a rough reception today for Prime Minister in Tasmania. I'll give you some footage on that. Welcome back. Still a lot to come. Pressure on Labor now to seriously look at the millions it gives to activist lawyers after that scathing judgment in the Santos case. Reports today that over $16 billion worth of critical resource projects are being held to ransom. And a bit later on, plenty of words to get through. Kelbachits, we kick off another year with your favourite wordsmith. But first, despite promising more transparency when it comes to cost blowouts in Queensland, it looks like Premier Stephen Miles is on the back foot already with a promised review into the costs associated with Brisbane's 2032 Olympic Games bid. Now, 2032 might seem a long way off, but they've got a whole lot of plans now to knock down and rebuild the Gabba. And it's looking like it's in serious doubt. The costs are estimated at $2.7 billion, but the opposition's already aware that the government's out there telling stakeholders this number is already on the rise. So no review, no oversight committee, and already mounting costs on a project that Miles himself announced as Deputy Premier. This isn't a good look for someone who's just in the job, and it's an election year. Joining me now, the Queensland Opposition Leader, David Crisafulli. Well, I tell you, I wanted Palaszczuk to go, but I hope you would see her out, David Crisafulli. But the Dill's got the top job. David Miles, I think he's the most stupid person in politics anywhere in the country. I hope you take him out, but he's likely to do a bit of budget damage before you get the chance.
What's going on at the moment is just farcical. It really is. Now, we have consistently said for years that the knockdown of the Gabba just doesn't have our support. It doesn't have Queenslanders' support. There's been no business case. Now, it's been his pet project. For 900 days, these guys have said it's the only option. They've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars justifying the decision. They haven't spoken with the local community, the local sporting community, the school community. And now we are hearing they are attempting to crab walk back to it to come to our position after nearly 1,000 days. The problem, Peter, is the obsession at the moment with this government is all about a sports stadium and a party for the rich and the famous. The whole idea of the Olympics was supposed to be about health, transport, housing, focusing, getting all levels of government together with one single focus, a generational 20-year tourism plan. That was the idea of the Olympics. But all it's turned out to be is a party for the rich and the famous, and these guys talking about sporting stadiums.
Yeah, you show me a project anywhere in the country, an infrastructure project where Labor's brought it in on budget and on time. And surely, particularly if you live outside of Brisbane, you're right to be asking, why can't this money be spent on the Bruce Highway, on hospitals, or hell, why can't it be spent on more police?
Well, the overruns of projects from this government alone that have either just been finished or in progress are in the order of about $14 billion. That's 2 Olympic Games. That just shows you how wasteful they are. That's the cost overruns. There's no diligence, there's no accountability, there's no KPIs. No one ever is held accountable for these blowouts. And as a result, we have projects that just run out of control. It is a broken government. They just don't value taxpayers' money. And increasingly, during a cost of living crisis, Queenslanders realise that every time government wastes their money, they come after yours.
I was just talking to Michael O'Brien about the crime situation down in Victoria. Now, you've seen some pretty horrific incidences in Queensland for a number of years now, but those domestic violence figures out today are shocking. A 57% increase in sexual offences alone. What's happening that it's got this bad in Queensland?
Peter, there has been so many reports over so many years with recommendations for all of the agencies to work together to do something, and those reports haven't been implemented. The first report where the government said this is the line in the sand was 2016. 2016, that's 7 years ago. There are still recommendations from that report that have never been implemented. And equally troubling, the government won't say what those recommendations are. All we know is that through a report that several of them weren't ever put into place. There's no transparency, there's no compassion, and as a result, we've got this scourge just racing through society.
David Christoforli, thank you for your time. Look, my assessment there of the Premier, David Miles, carefully done. I could have been a lot worse than just saying he's stupid, and I stand by those comments very professionally. I look and read and follow everything he does, and he's just not up to the job. All right, let's bring in my panel. Liberal Senator Claire Chandler, Shadow Environment Minister John O'Donoghue. Senators, welcome. I'll start with you if I can, John O'Donoghue. The Teals today, the federal Teals, have come out and said at the next election they're going to push for a 75% reduction by 2035 in emissions. Now, this is a lot higher than Labor's current target of 43%. These Teals, I used to think they were Labor light, but I think they're just Greens in more expensive clothing. What do you think?
Well, there's a saying in politics I'm sure you and your listeners, your viewers rather, are familiar with, and that is you can't outgreen the Greens. But I think, Peter, we've just been proven wrong on that one. The Teals are very much outgreening the Greens on this one. 75% reduction in emissions in this country. And remembering that Australia only produces just over 1% of global emissions, it's rather a farcical effort that they're expecting Australians to go to save the planet, which won't happen, but it will drive up costs. But I've got a novel idea, and I think we should trial their target in their seats alone instead of dictating to the rest of the country what we should do.
Good idea.
Reduction in their seats and see how it goes.
Absolutely. They're all in beachside suburbs in Victoria and in New South Wales. We'll put wind farms all along the sand and see what people think about that. Let's go to the terrible reality, if I can, Claire Chandler. We've got 1,600 companies across Australia, manufacturing and construction in particular, that have announced insolvency in the past 6 months. Now, that's just a number of businesses. Of course, the number of jobs, thousands and thousands more. The PM talked a big game before the last election, saying he was going to bring manufacturing back to Australia, but a lot more was left under his watch and been returned. Why the big failure?
Well, Peter, I think the main reason we're seeing a failure here is because we've seen so many failures of this government, and we know that's because they have their priorities completely wrong. In the lead up to the last election, Prime Minister Albanese was more than happy to say that he was going to rebuild the manufacturing industry in Australia by the end of his first term of government. Well, we're halfway through that term now, and like you say, on those numbers, our manufacturing industry is only going backwards. Companies are leaving Australian shores, and we instead spent the first 18 months of the Albanese government talking about his failed voice referendum. So once again, this is another example of this government having its priorities absolutely wrong, and Australians are losing out as a result.
Jono, calls today again for the Environmental Defenders Office to be defunded. Tony Abbott defunded them back in 2014. Labor reinstated that funding. The judgment from Justice Charlesworth in this giant Santos case that's been brought down, I mean, it's absolutely embarrassing for this organisation. Surely taxpayers shouldn't be paying them to go against government decisions, government projects that our budget desperately needs?
Spot on. It should be a defunding of the EDO with immediate effect. I mean, Justice Charlesworth gave what I think is an uncharacteristically scathing assessment of the EDO's lack of integrity. The fact that they were manipulating and coaching witnesses to suit their arguments was, I think, astounding to read about, but it actually points to everything the Coalition have been saying about the EDO and why Tony Abbott, quite rightly, all those years ago, defunded this organisation. It doesn't deserve the support it's getting. I'm all for community legal services where we're helping those who need it in the community, women's legal services, tenants' unions and the like. But this is about stopping projects, like you say, $16 billion worth of projects. It's like we have an autoimmune disease in this government. What government funds an organisation to then go and legally appeal its own decisions? That causes job losses and economic destruction. It is madness, and they should end the funding today.
Claire, I want to pick up something you've brought to light today, that the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne is offering gender-affirming care to toddlers as young as 3 years of age. How on earth can someone 3 years of age consent to this?
Well, it's really concerning, isn't it, Peter? And I think most fair-minded Australians would look at that and think there is no way that a child that young can be consenting rather to those sorts of procedures. And this is why I've been calling for quite some time now for an independent review into the gender treatment practices that we are seeing in Australia. Internationally, we have example after example after example of jurisdictions looking very carefully at what gender-affirming practices are occurring locally and regulating to stop these practices from happening where they are harmful for children. We're seeing it in Australia, and authorities have their heads in the sand. So, like I say, that's why I'm calling for a review. And this recent example from the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne is just the latest in a long line of really concerning stories.
And look, I'll remind my viewers that when you push for that review in the federal parliament to use Senate resources to run the case for and against gender affirming care, so if they think it's a great idea, the experts can come and put their case. That's been blocked by the Senate. And I read with interest a court case will allow an expert to come forward in that court case to give expert advice, their position on gender dysphoria and whether or not gender affirming care, sex change information, etc., can be provided to a child. Because the Parliament won't do a decent inquiry, this is playing out in the courts, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very interesting in that regard, Peter. And like I said, many authorities in Australia have completely had their heads in the sand around this issue. I've been writing to health authorities at all levels of government for quite some time now, expressing concern about this and not getting much back in response. So I think it is very promising to see at least our court system taking a very even-handed approach to getting evidence around this incredibly important issue. So certainly a positive development from that respect, yes.
Donna, you're in Tasmania. The PM was down there today. He was targeted by protesters against the salmon farming industry in your state. What's the issue? Why are people so angry?
Well, as you'd know, Peter, we've got a tradition of certain cohorts in our community being angry. First it was dams, then it was forestry, now it's salmon. And the catalyst for all of this is the review that the Labor government are undertaking into whether or not salmon farming can occur on the west coast of Tasmania. What I do think, and I might also add that review was catalysed by the EDO we were just talking about. They're the ones who are backing in this anti-industry activity. But those protesters should not worry, because I suspect Anthony Albanese is going to acquiesce, he's going to crumble, and he's going to shut down the industry on the west coast. Much in the same way Mark Latham in 2004 tried to shut down the native forestry industry in Tasmania, and that paved the way for John Howard to have the victory that he did at that election. So Labor aren't the friend of the worker, they're the friend of the inner city Green voter, and those protesters should feel very comfortable and stop being angry.
John, just before we go, explain to people, our salmon industry earns us billions of dollars in export dollars. Obviously, it's for Australian consumption as well, but it's one of the best regulated in the world. We won't stop eating salmon. We'll just get it from places where they don't have our environmental practices, surely.
That's precisely what will happen. We'll offshore not only the environmental degradation to countries, South American countries where I don't think they have any rules around how they run their salmon farms. We'll offshore the economic activity. In Tasmania alone, there's roughly 5,000 jobs. The industry is worth about $1 billion to Tasmania. So, this is what happens. The green activist groups find ways in, legal avenues to try and challenge the industry. Government who are chasing these inner city elite votes, people that don't understand what is at stake here and what the ultimate environmental outcome will be, might feel good about themselves, but we are doing our country a service. So I support the industry and I hope the PM does, but I have a real fear that he won't.
We will watch this one closely. Senator Duniam, Senator Chandler, thank you both for your time. All right, after the break, always on a Wednesday, last year, this year, every year. Kel Richards after the break. Welcome back. Well, it might be a new year, but one thing that won't be changing is Kel Richards joining me every Wednesday for Words Matter. So welcome, Kel, welcome, and let's kick off 2024. We've got some topical words tonight. We saw the Trump win, emphatic win in the Iowa caucuses yesterday. We discussed a little bit on the show the difference between a primary and a caucus. But where's the word actually come from?
Well, it has two meanings. It's got the meaning that we discovered in Iowa, where people gather to cast votes for a candidate, but it also has the meaning we use in the Australian Parliament, when a party or a faction gather together, they caucus together to decide how they'll vote. The word emerged in America in the mid-1700s, and when it first emerged, caucus meant a club. So it was a kind of sociable gathering, and you could sort of see how the idea of a gathering, getting together people who are like-minded, could grow into those two meanings of the word caucus. But when we look at where it comes from, it's really interesting. The Oxford give up on this. They throw their hands in the air and say origin unknown. They guess that it might come from an old post-classical Latin word for a drinking cup, which would sort of fit in with the club idea. But then they say there's no direct evidence. But the American dictionary, the Merriam-Webster's Third International Unabridged, they have the answer. They've tracked it down to an American Algonquin word. The Algonquins were Native Americans who lived in what is now roughly the state of Virginia, so sort of roundabout where Washington, D.C. is. And they had a word very much like this for a gathering of the chiefs, of the elders. The Merriam-Webster is certain that's where it came from, an Algonquin word. And if they say that, I'm persuaded.
And of course, in Canberra, if all Labor MPs get in a room together, that's called caucus. And if all the Libs get together, including with the Nats, it's called a party room meeting. That's the difference. A lot of people get that wrong. Hey, boycott. We've talked about these boycotts over the sale of Australia Day merchandise. There's a story behind the word boycott.
There's a lovely story behind boycott. It comes from Captain Charles Cunningham Boycott, who was an Englishman. He was farming in Ireland in the 1880s. He was a land agent for one of these absentee English landlords, one of the wealthy lords. He decided, he was approached by his tenant farmers during a bad season asking for a major cut in the rents. He said no. And the Irish Land League said the way to tackle this is simply to deny him everything. So he found in County Mayo, which is where he was, he couldn't have any services. No one would harvest his fields, couldn't shop at the local shops. Even his letters, his post wasn't delivered. And so it became so passionate and so widely known that very quickly it became a byword. It is an eponym, a person's name that becomes a generic name. Remember Captain Boycott.
There you go. Hey, next week we'll be on the cusp of Australia Day. We're proud of Australia Day here on Sky News. So head to ozwords.com.au. Give us your Australian rhyming slang. We might give that a bell next week when we have Kel on again on Wednesday. Great to see you, Kel. See you next week. All right, that's it from me. Up next, Andrew Bolt.